All right. Hi, everyone. How are we all doing today? Good, good. I am well. I'm excited. I'm excited for this lecture. This is a fun one. So now that I've shared my screen and it is officially 2:35, we will get right to it. So today we're looking at the first chapter in our course text by Jagwon Kim. So this chapter is just an introduction to the philosophy of mind. And so we're going to stick pretty close to the text today. Um, I will kind of make a little additions and a little bit of I have a little bit of commentary to offer on some of the things that Kim says here in this first chapter. But we won't, well, as I said, we're going to stick pretty close to the material. I won't substantially depart, um, except that I would like to spend a little bit of time getting your impressions of They're Made Out of Meat. So if you've read Bisson's short story or watched the film adaptation, or hopefully you've done both, really. But, one or the other is fine. But I'm wondering what you make of this film or the story. So, synopsis is we've got these aliens who are observing people on the planet Earth, and they seem quite shocked and dismayed that we are merely made out of meat. After all, we're able to um, build machines to talk to one another. We talk, we communicate with each other via spoken language, and we seem to be doing this all thanks to our meat brains. And these aliens are sort of dismayed that these creatures who are merely made out of meat are able to do all of these things that creatures with minds can do. Whatever kind of mind these alien beings might have, must be pretty different from what we do, from what we have. And whatever kind of minds we're talking about, whatever kind of alien minds we're talking about, they must be different enough that these aliens are rather shocked that we meat creatures, these meat machines, as Andy Clark might call them, the human beings, are able to do anything mental at all. Um, so, what were your impressions?
I laughed.
Oh, okay. You watched, I take it you watched the film?
No, I read the story. It was actually interesting. I was like, what? At first, but then at the end, I got it.
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
something new, like out of the box.
it is, and it's one of those short stories that's kind of gone viral in a sense. A lot of philosophy professors use this in their courses. Some I mentioned a moment ago, Andy Clark references the story in his book Mindware. Um, so it's made the rounds, and it's good for us to keep in mind. Um, so before I say anything else, other impressions on the film or the short story? Whenever I don't hear from too many students, I worry that perhaps the material was not read. But I'm sure you all read it. Yeah, meatheads. Or the part where they're talking about how they took some of us onto their spacecraft, and I think the line is we went into their skulls and smoothed out their meat, so that they won't remember being abducted. I like that. Timothy, go ahead.
I think it reminds me of something called like substance dualism, where it's like either the meat, I guess, can have the properties of like mental states and physical states, or maybe the aliens think of it as just the physical state. So like, how could it produce mental states if there's no like other functioning going on in there?
Yeah, and that's really good. So, of course, we're going to talk about substance dualism in detail next time, but that's one of the reasons why um, philosophy instructors like me have their students read this or watch the film. We are, as philosophers of mind, or perhaps potential philosophers of mind, like yourselves, we're faced with the same sort of question or set of questions that these aliens are faced with in the story. So, how can meat think, right? We all accept, I think most of us, if not all of us here, accept that um, the organ which enables um, all of the mental phenomena that we know, thinking, feeling, perceiving, sensing, etc. That organ is the brain, and the brain is made out of meat. I mean, that's a crude way to put it, but it's a biological organ, right? So we have these meat brains, like a meat computer, or I bring it back to Andy Clark, wetware, right? We could call it wetware. When we talk of computers, artificial computers, we have hardware and software. Well, we have wetware in the brain, and perhaps we can think of the mind as mindware. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole because Clark's is not the textbook that we're using for this class. Um, but you get the idea, right? How can meat think? Um, that's the question the aliens are faced with, and that is, in a sense, the question we're faced with. And I want everybody to keep this in mind as we go through this material for today, especially the first bit of the chapter, where Kim is talking about the differences between the way we categorize different beings. So we've got different beings like animate and inanimate beings. And when I say being, I don't exclusively mean living beings. I mean entities. So there are non-living entities and there are living entities, and then out of those living entities, there are also entities with minds. But we're all made of the same stuff. Um, so, how do we explain the mental? It's part of the problem that we're going to be faced with, or challenged with, trying to answer in this course. Cole says it's interesting thinking about AI. That's kind of how it feels to comprehend large language model thinking. Yeah, that's a good insight as well. Um, I mean, we can ask how it is that creatures like us can think. Um, why is it that we have minds? And how do those minds work? How does thought and consciousness arise out of these physical interactions that are going on in the wetware that is our brain? We could ask the same thing about a machine, right? How is it that if computers think, how is it that this comes to happen using circuits and silicon chips and so forth, right? And this is something we will also get to in this course when we cover machine functionalism and causal theoretical functionalism. So stay tuned for that. But we can ask we can ask the same question, right? We've got this non-thinking physical stuff that we're made out of, and yet we can think. Maybe there are artificial cognitive systems, again, made out of non-thinking stuff. But according to some, they can think. How does that happen? Trying to understand these issues is part of what we are going to do here. Grant says, I thought it was interesting that they thought that meat couldn't have a mind or thoughts, or I think they said dreams somewhere too. Yeah, a dream to meat. This is after they've smoothed out the brains, smoothed out the meat of the people that they had abducted. How interesting that we should be meat's dream. As if these people who have had their meat smoothed out after being abducted will think they've just had a dream, or will be regarded as insane. These aliens are just meat's dream, a dream to meat. Um, some humans, continue with Grant's comment. Some humans think that computers machines can't think. It's a nice point of view. I also assumed they were machines, robots, rather than some non-carbon based life. So that shaped my own interpretation. So yeah, perhaps the aliens are a radically different form of life. I was thinking about this actually when I was um, prepping for today's lecture because a few weeks ago I went and saw that movie, Project Hail Mary, right? Thought it was fun. Thought that was a real fun movie. But of course, Rocky, the alien that Ryan Gosling meets up there in space is very, very different from we humans. Um, but I think those of us who watched the film would certainly say that Rocky thinks, and that other creatures like him also think, even though their biology is radically different from ours, right? Um, And you mentioned machines. One thing that we don't really get into in too much detail in this course, but which I certainly have in one of my first year seminars called Minds and Machines. We In that seminar we learn about how um, the human being has um, the human being has been looked at in various ways across history. Um, And if you go back to the ancient Greeks, right around the classical period, Plato and Aristotle, we were regarded in one sense or another as a kind of animal that has a special sort of soul. So Plato understood us as living beings who had a soul that, well, had three parts essentially. We had the part of the soul with logos, with reason. There was also a sort of spirited part of the soul, the part with thumos. So that part of the soul governs emotions or the passions. And then the part of the soul that has eros or desire. This is your basic desires and drives, hunger, thirst, the need for sleep, um, sexual, romantic desire, that kind of thing, right? Aristotle also thought that we were creatures with souls, but his view of the soul is quite different from Plato's. Um, for Aristotle, the soul is an organizing principle. The soul is what informs the matter of our bodies. And we humans, we have three sort of parts of soul, if you like. We have our rational soul. We are the zoon, echon, logon for Aristotle, the animal with reason or with logos. And we also have a sensitive soul, which allows for perception and locomotion, and a nutritive soul, consuming nutriment, growing, and reproducing. Now, the interesting thing is that for Aristotle, every living being has at least some part of soul. Um, Plants only have nutritive souls. Animals, non-human animals, have nutritive souls and sensitive souls, and the human being has nutritive, sensitive, and the rational soul. But over time, we started to view the human body as more and more machine-like. Once we get to the early modern period, kind of right around the time that preceded the scientific revolution, we started to look at the cosmos or the world as well as ourselves as natural machines. And that includes the mind. Not really with Descartes. Descartes, we'll see next time. Descartes thinks the body is like a machine. The mind is not. The mind is the soul, an immaterial thinking substance. But once you get past Descartes and you start looking at, well, not even past, his contemporary Thomas Hobbes, um, 18th and 19th century thinkers like Julien Offray de la Mettrie or Thomas Henry Huxley, they start talking about the human being as a machine in terms of the body and in terms of the mind. And eventually you get all the way up to the 20th century where you get Alan Turing and Hilary Putnam, who thought of thinking as computation, as information processing. So maybe we are meat machines, and that is why we have minds. Meat machines are the kinds of creatures that have minds. So perhaps artificial machines, like computers or robots, could have minds. Excuse my long digression there. I just think this is all very interesting. Um, Tara says, I think the ending was interesting. They're willing to erase the minds of the meat, knowing that the meat doesn't have any contact with anyone else in the universe, but then go on to acknowledge how unbearably, unutterably cold the universe would be if one were all alone. Yeah, there's a certain sort of, I guess, a certain kind of irony to the aliens' actions. They're condemning us to being alone because they don't want us finding out about these aliens, and the aliens want to forget what they've seen here, sort of condemning themselves to a sort of cosmic loneliness. Just because I suppose they cannot fathom the idea of thinking meat, um, which is very interesting. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's like I think these alien creatures accept that we seem to be thinking, but have no idea how it's supposed to work. Um, and again, that is kind of the situation that we find ourselves in as philosophers who are interested in understanding the nature of the mental. So that's very good. I think that it's evident that you guys really thought about what was going on there in this short story, and that's great. Um, I think this is again, this is a sort of helpful, illustrative sort of thing to keep in mind as we proceed through the material for today, but also as we proceed through the rest of the course. So now let's turn our attention toward chapter one of Kim, which is the introduction, not just to the book, but to the field of philosophy of mind. I think I would have titled this chapter something like "What is philosophy of mind?" because that's the question that Kim is engaging with. Um, Maybe I'll just entitle this lecture "What is philosophy of mind?" when I throw it up on the YouTube channel. But Kim starts out by pointing out that we categorize all sorts of things in different ways. Um, Here, let's say thing and being, these are interchangeable. Or, as I said earlier, entities, things, entities, beings, objects, etc. One of the things we do, one of the ways we categorize different things are, as I mentioned a moment ago, into um, those that are alive and those that are not alive. That is, those that are animate and inanimate. And we also categorize of things that are alive. We categorize some of those into non-thinking and thinking things, or beings with minds and beings that do not have minds. And you can kind of gain a sense here what we were just talking about, um, the dilemma that the aliens in They're Made Out of Meat are in, right? I found myself when I was preparing for this lecture, I found myself thinking of the words of American astronomer Carl Sagan. I wonder if any of you know where I'm going with this. Do we have any Carl Sagan fans in the room? Not in the room. We're not in a room, but you get my drift. Yeah, legend, right? So what did Carl Sagan say about human beings? He said, not in a room. Sure, we can leave rooms. In fact, once the weather improves, I think I'm going to lecture outside, um, which is not a room. Um, Carl Sagan said of the human being, um, he said, "We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. What did he mean? Well, everything that we're made up of. We're made up of lots of different chemical elements, right? And not just chemical elements, complex organic molecules, chemical compounds, right? What are some of the stuff that we're made of? What are some of these things? I know we have some astrophysicists in the room, so someone should be able to answer. Iron, yes, we iron in our blood, right? Carbon, yes. Water, lots of vitamins. Yeah, well, there's hydrogen in the water that we're made of, right? What else we got? Calcium in our bones. Um, those vitamins, the micronutrients, right? We need things like magnesium, sodium chloride, right? We're made up of lots of stuff. It's kind of like that show, Full Metal Alchemist. you know, the Elric brothers try to revive their deceased mother using alchemy, which is a science in this universe. So they put all of the material to make a human being into like a basin and try and transmute it into a human. Doesn't go well, but that's kind of like the inciting incident for the for this particular story, right? We're kind of like that. We're made up of all of these naturally occurring um, elements and chemical compounds, and all of these things, all of these uh, kinds of materials, heavier than hydrogen and helium and so forth, are made in stars. From basically nuclear fusion happening in the cores of these stars. So you get atoms being smushed together, becoming heavier elements, all the way up to iron, and then the stuff that's heavier than iron, that's created when we have these massive supernova explosions. So yes, the materials that we are made out of were created billions of years ago in these stars that have just exploded and spewed the materials for life out into the cosmos. So we're quite literally made of star stuff. So is everything, the planet Earth, the trees out there in the yard, the birds flying around in the trees, the cat over there that you cannot see at the moment, all made of the same stuff. But some of these things are not alive. The rocks out there in the yard, not alive. The trees are alive, and we're made of the same sort of stuff. I am alive like the tree, but unlike the tree, I have a mind. So me and, again, to quote Carl Sagan, our cousins the trees are made of very much the same stuff. But most thinkers would agree that where human beings have minds, trees do not. Although there are some people who would disagree with me on that. So we're the kinds of thing that have a mind. We think, perceive, we can act. These are all things that are enabled by our minds. These are things that arguably trees and rocks cannot do. And we even think we're quite special because of our minds. Kim says that we're apt to regard ourselves as occupying a special and distinctive place in the natural world on account of our particularly highly developed mental capacities and functions, such as the capacity for abstract thoughts, self-consciousness, artistic abilities, complex emotions, and a capacity for rational deliberation and action. Certainly, other creatures besides ourselves have minds, but at least as far as we know, no other creatures um, have done the sorts of things that we have. Um, our minds have enabled us to write symphonies, to travel to space, and there may be other life forms out there in the universe that have done that. But at least on Earth, we seem to be unique, right? Um, So a mind is quite a special thing to have, and at least for the moment, we seem to be unique um, in terms of what our minds have enabled us to do. But I don't know. Other creatures might have, if not language, communication that's quite sophisticated and perhaps comes close to language. Um, we've taught great apes sign language, for example, but no great ape has ever asked a spontaneous question. Um, Cetaceans um, might have some kind of language, but we don't know for certain, right? But whether these creatures have minds that are like ours in that respect, we can agree that they certainly have minds. So besides apes and cetaceans, other creatures that we have mind that we would probably agree have minds are our pets, dogs, cats, other highly intelligent creatures like elephants. In fact, I've put elephants twice here, so I guess elephants must have great minds if they're in this list twice. Oops. Other creatures that have pretty sophisticated minds, well, certain birds. Um, yeah. Have I seen the freaky dog that talks with the buttons? Oh, so I've seen a lot of those freaky dogs. Uh, the problem with those is so there's something that the human mind is vulnerable to called apophenia, which is perceiving meaningful patterns where there are none. And I have to admit that I am quite skeptical of these dog button pushing means of communication. I actually don't think the dogs understand what they're saying. I think this is a result of apophenia. So I'm sorry to be disappointing there, but um, yeah, I'm quite skeptical that those dogs are actually communicating in a language-like way. Um, Matt says, or Matthew, or Matt, if hope that's okay. I would argue that trees and many plants can think in a much more basic form, since trees will grow to reach sunlight in unique shapes or grow roots around or through rocks against its normal pattern of growing roots. Yes, that's a good point. And we call this plant cognition. Um, Now, I don't want to get I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I guess we're just about there. Of the things that Kim says do not have minds, well, trees, right, are not generally considered to be thinking things, nor are bacteria or viruses. But it can be hard to tell. So the third point here, right where I'm here, I think I can. Ah, yes, look at that. I can underline sick. All right. Is the sunflower thinking or perceiving when it follows the sun across the sky? Right? So sunflowers and lots of other um oh no, no, it's okay, Matthew. No, no. It's good that you're thinking like this. Um but sunflowers exhibit something called heliotropism. Other kinds of flowers do this too. Dandelions, for example, right? They open up in the morning and they face the sun and they follow it across the sky. Um, Now, this is all possible because, um, well, plants have kind of like we have. They have chemical messengers flowing throughout the plant, right? Plants kind of have their own version of a circulatory system, and it's not just water and nutrients flowing through. There are also these little chemical messengers that can enable plants to do things like track a light source as it moves. Um, is that thinking? Some people would argue that it is. It's very simple, a very simple form of cognition, if it is cognition. Um, but some would say that it counts. Or you can think of the Venus flytrap. You ever see a Venus flytrap close around a fly? Maybe, you can buy these plants and keep them in your house, or you can watch a video on the internet if you like. But these plants don't just snap closed as soon as an insect lands in the flower. It's a flower that's adapted, right, to chomp the insect and digest it slowly. But they don't just close whenever an insect lands in there because it's very resource intensive for the plant to shut. And if the plant closes and there's nothing in there and there's no new source of food, the plant might die because it's so resource intensive to do this. So the Venus flytrap actually has like a little trigger mechanism. It has these little hairs in its flowers, and the insect will come and land, and it'll tap one of those hairs. And once it does that, a little chemical timer starts within the plant. If another hair gets tapped within 20 seconds, then the flower will close. But if a fly, say, comes and lands and taps one hair and doesn't tap any other hairs, the plant will not close. Is that cognitive? Is that thinking? Some might say so. So, other questions, right? Does a beehive think? Maybe creatures that live in hives, like bees or ants, are not individually very smart. But maybe as a group they are smarter. So maybe we could see like a beehive or an ant colony collectively thinks. Um, who knows? So sometimes it's hard to tell. I think it's also hard to tell when it comes to machines. I mean, artificial machines. Could a robot or a computer have a mind? Well, I think so. Yes. Um, but others will disagree. Yeah, ants have wars. It's the army of the ants. Yeah. Ants have also, well, virtual ants have been used to try and solve problems. So, one really interesting example concerns what we call the traveling salesman problem. Anybody know about the traveling salesman problem? Okay. Janet knows. Flip a coin. I don't know about any coin flips, but it's where you have, you know, n number of cities, say five. And you have to calculate how to visit all of the cities using the most efficient route. We can do this if the number of cities are small, but let's say I have n 20 cities and I have to calculate the most efficient means of visiting them all. The computational power that I would need to do that is ridiculous. It's not something we can easily solve. You'd think we could, but once you start expanding the number of cities that you have to visit, um, the computational resources that you need to solve the problem increase so much so that it would take, far too long to calculate the best answer. Janet says, yeah, you could look for a good answer rather than the best answer. And that's what we did with these virtual ants. So some researchers programmed a sort of version of the traveling salesman problem, and they used virtual ants. And just like real ants, these ants kind of just go wherever, but they leave a pheromone trail for other ants to follow. And the more ants follow that trail, the more pheromones there are that build up. And eventually you get these sort of ant highways. And so by programming a sort of traveling salesman situation with these virtual ants into a computer simulation, they were able to show how this virtual ant colony, by virtue of their virtual pheromone trails, would converge on a good answer to the traveling salesman problem. So that's kind of interesting. And maybe real ants do something similar when they're out there, marching around, as ants do. Well, Kim says, surely these simpler creatures, like animals, non-human animals, like our dogs and our cats, for example, surely they have sensations, we think, for they react in appropriate ways to noxious stimuli, and they have sense organs through which they gain information about what goes on around them and adjust and modify their behavior accordingly. But do they have minds? Are they conscious? Do they have mentality? What is it to have a mind or mentality, right? Even the earthworm here that we didn't really talk about can sense its environment. They come out when it's rainy, um, or when there's a lot of dew on the grass. The worms like to come out. As it starts to get drier, the worms retreat into the soil. They seem to know. Um, they sense and come to know what the optimal conditions are for emerging from the soil. But do they have minds? Are they conscious? Right? What does it even mean to have a mind? That is what philosophy of mind is concerned with. So remember, philosophy is a field of inquiry or an area of inquiry where we ask fundamental questions. That's a way that I like to characterize it. So philosophy comes from the Greek philia and sophia, means love of wisdom. A philosopher is a lover of wisdom. And what that means for many of us is that we engage with fundamental questions about all types of things. And so in philosophy of mind, what we're doing is asking fundamental questions concerning the nature of the mental, right? What is a mind? What is it to have a mind? Um, Now, Kim thinks that this field, philosophy of mind, is defined by a certain set of problems, and we'll talk about those problems in a moment. Um, one set of problems or questions concerns what counts as mental. So, I'd say I have a mind, and you all have minds. But think back to the example of plant cognition. Some people would say, well, what the sunflower does when it follows the sun across the sky, or what the Venus flytrap does when it closes around an insect, that is mental. And others will say, no, it's not. So that's one question. What counts as mental? Another question concerns the relation between mental properties and mental states. Um, what are mental states anyway? Maybe we can try and come up with some examples of mental states. Anyone want to take a stab at it? We actually will enumerate quite a few examples toward the end of this lecture. Um, but mental states might be, things like beliefs. Um, Beliefs and desires. Those are two big ones that philosophers like to talk about. Yeah, mood. A mood could be a mental state. Timothy?
Oh yeah, I was gonna say happiness and sadness, but
Yeah. So
maybe also
emotions.
like intentions.
Yep, intentions. So if I form the intention to pick up my coffee cup and take a sip, that's a mental state. Yeah, being awake. Um, you know, Consciousness. Um, there are sort of degrees of consciousness. Like right now, I'm pretty awake and aware. Um, but when I was just waking up, I was not very awake. And when I was asleep, I wasn't awake at all. Um, Desires, yep. These are all mental states. So, how do all of these mental properties and mental states relate to one another? That's another set of questions. Yet another concerns the relationship between the mind and the body. And this gets us back to our discussion on non-living things, living things, and living things with minds, right? What is the relationship between the mind and the body? Just back to the chat. Grant says, during exam season when I was studying, my mind felt full. Ha, yeah, maybe. Could that be a mental state? Yeah, like you felt like you were at capacity. Yeah, I mean, I would say that's a kind of mental state. There's something that it's like to, I guess, have studied as much as you can. So I would say that that counts. Even knowing a fact is a mental state. So if you study for your philosophy exam and you've learned, oh, philosophy means love of wisdom. I know that philosophy means love of wisdom. That's a mental state that you're in. When you are thinking, oh yeah, I know that. That's a mental state too. So so a central question for Kim and many other philosophers, and certainly a question that will occupy us throughout this course, is the question, what is the relationship between the mind and the body? I mean, the body, again, I'm made of all that star stuff. I'm made of organic molecules. I'm made of chemical compounds. Um, my brain is too. My brain is made of meat, just like I am. But I seem to have a mind. And it sounds funny to say that my mind is made out of meat. Sure, my brain is made out of meat, but my mind seems to be something else. My mind seems to be something I'm thinking with. Um, so how are minds and bodies related to one another? That's called the mind-body problem. One possible answer is, as Kim says, that the mental seems so prima facie seems prima facie so utterly different from the physical, and yet the two seem intimately related to one another. Um, if you're trying to get your mind around this, think again of the aliens from They're Made Out of Meat. These meat creatures are thinking how they're made out of meat. Well, how am I thinking? I'm made out of meat. I wonder, just as these aliens do, how it is that I have a mind and what the relation between the mental and the physical is. So this is the mind-body problem. It's the challenge of explaining how the mind and the body are related to one another. And this has been a problem, well, for a long, 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 long time. Kim sort of takes uh, Descartes' philosophy as where this problem originated from, and in the modern tradition, that is true, but the problem really goes back a lot further than that. Arguably back to Plato, at least, because Plato thought that, again, for Plato, the mind is the soul, the rational soul. And Plato seems to think of the body as something like a ship or a chariot. Um, so the mind might be like the pilot of a ship, and it's controlling the ship as a pilot does. Um, or the chariot analogy. The rational soul is a bit like the driver of a chariot, and the appetitive and the spirited souls, right? The part of the soul with eros and with thumos, they're like these flying horses pulling the chariot, right? And the spirited soul wants to go up, and the appetitive soul wants to go down. And the job of the rational soul is to govern these horses so that they are on an even keel and that they pull you properly. Um, so for Plato, the body, and you can, if you want to read more on this, read the Phaedo, the Platonic dialogue that recounts the final hours of Socrates' life. Socrates gives us his theories of soul, right? And we can plainly see that for Plato, the soul is a spiritual substance. The body is like a material, corporeal substance. The soul is immortal, imperishable, and divine. The body is corporeal, corruptible. Um, it distracts us from doing philosophy. So, Socrates isn't afraid to die because, now he won't have this old body anymore that gets hungry and gets sleepy. He'll just be, like a soul up there with the pure forms, and he can do philosophy up there without this disease of life um, hindering him. So when he takes the poison, he says to his friend Crito, like, don't forget to sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius, the god of medicine and healing, because he's drinking the poison, the pharmacon, but pharmacon could also be a medicine. So he's being cured of the illness of life. That's not the way I look at it, but that's the way Socrates, or Plato's version of Socrates, seems to have seen it. But all this is to say that the problem of understanding the relation of the mind and the body is a little older than what Kim than Descartes, you know. But sure, if we're just going to limit ourselves to the modern period and onward, then yeah, I guess it starts with Descartes. But do you see why the mind-body problem is a problem for philosophers? I mean, we're physical beings. We are made of matter. Um, how does a mind arise out of that, right? Um, Even if you look at my brain and my central nervous system, we've got signals traveling through nerves. We've got neurons firing. Little changes in um, changes in electrical potential at the synapses cause information to travel from neuron to neuron. These are all physical processes. How do these physical events give rise to mental events like, say, being in pain, right? That's one aspect of the mind body problem. Say I stub my toe, right? Now I've got tissue damage, which causes my nerve cells to fire. And those signals reach the brain, where a special type of unmyelinated neuron called a C fiber starts to fire. And I go, ouch! And I experience an unpleasant, painy sensation in my toe. How does that mental event, the sensation of pain, arise from those physical events? So that's one side, one aspect of the mind body problem. And there's kind of another side to this too, right? We also wonder how it is that mental events, if they cause physical events, how do they cause physical events? So, think of a situation like I've described on the slides. Maybe I experience rumbling in my tummy, um, and I form the belief that I'm hungry. So, I can feel those pangs of hunger. I can hear my stomach grumbling. I say to myself, "Wow, you know what? I'm getting hungry, but I don't want to be hungry." Um, the sensation and subsequent belief that I am hungry, um, coupled with my desire to satisfy that hunger, might cause me to get up and make a sandwich. But how? um, okay, so I have a belief and a desire. I have further beliefs and desires like, okay, I believe I'm hungry. I desire not to be hungry. I believe there's some ingredients to make a sandwich in the fridge. And I believe that I can get up and make the sandwich, right? Like I have all kinds of background beliefs here, like where food is kept, how to make sandwiches, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of this I'm not even conscious of. Maybe I'm making the grilled cheese sandwich and I just know by intuition it's time to flip that sandwich over. Otherwise, it's going to burn, right? These are These are all like beliefs, desires, perceptions, thoughts, sensations, beliefs, etc., that I'm having, and how do they cause my body to move the way it does in such a complex way where I'm getting up and going to the fridge and beginning to prepare a sandwich, right? How does it happen? And does that even capture how it all works, right? This is the problem with mental causation. Can mental events cause physical events? And if so, how? That's the problem of mental causation. We'll cover that later. That's another aspect of the mind-body problem. For now, just think of it like this. Minds and bodies seem like completely different kinds of things. How could mental um, states or mental events like beliefs, desires, so forth, arise from purely physical states or physical events? Or as Kim puts it, how can we accommodate minds and mentality in such an austerely material world? That is our main question. So I think you see why the mind body problem is a problem for philosophers. I don't know. What do you think? Have you ever thought about this before? Have you ever said to yourself, like, how is it that my, my beliefs, my desires, my thoughts, my emotions, my conscious experiences, how is it that that arises out of the physical operations of the brain? How could my desires and my beliefs interact to cause me to make a sandwich or make a cup of coffee? How does that work if they seem like such different kinds of things, the mental and the physical? Grant's thought about it. Good. It's all electrical signals in our meat computer. Well, I don't disagree with you, Matthew, but then how is it that let's okay, here we go. Here's a good example. How is it if I look at this lovely Granny Smith apple, how is it that all of these physical happenings in the mind and in the world result in my having a subjective experience of the color green, right? So we've got light hitting the apple. The apple's surface is such that it absorbs a lot of the different wavelengths of light, but it reflects green. And those little photons hit my retina and cause my cones to fire at a certain frequency and send that information down my optic nerve to the occipital lobe at the back of the brain, or the posterior of the brain. And then from there to the temporal areas of my brain, such that I go, the apple is green. Where's the green? The surface of the apple isn't really green. It just reflects green wavelengths of visible electromagnetic radiation. The photons hitting my eyes aren't green. The signals in my nerves aren't green. If you look at my occipital lobe or in my temporal lobes, you won't see anything green in there. So, how is it that out of all of these little physical events, I come to have this subjective experience of a green apple? There are a lot of different answers to this question, and we're going to explore quite a few of them in this class. So it is electrical signals, but it's not just electrical signals. Cole says one thing I found is that one thing I found that is kind of interesting is the mental state you're in, particularly how confident you are, seems to have an impact on your physical abilities in sports. Like I find I react quicker while in a confident mental state. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's another element to this, right? Like you have days where you're really on, and you have days where you're really off. Um, and it's hard to sort of disentangle the relation between the mental and the physical here. You might say like, "Oh, I'm having an off day because I didn't have a good night's sleep." Okay. Well, why didn't you get a good night's sleep? Maybe you were nervous about the big game, right? So it seems like the mental can affect the physical, which can then affect the mental, which can then affect the physical. And the problem is working out how. How do we even see mental images? Good question. I mean, I guess I gave you a sort of physicalist description with my Apple example, but how does a subjective experience of a green apple arise out of all of that? We really don't know. Storm says it's easy to just go about your day thinking you only know things to be true because they are true to you, just because. Yeah, well, we take a lot of things for granted. I think a lot of people, for example, absolutely would grant that the Earth is round and that it orbits the sun, even though they might not actually have a solid scientific grasp about how it all works. Um, which is not to say that their beliefs are false, but maybe that they have a sort of folk notions about these things, right? So that's why the mind body problem is a problem. Um, let's talk about some metaphysical preliminaries. So, metaphysics is one of those terms that gets thrown around in the popular discourse. And I think a lot of people who don't study philosophy are probably pretty misinformed about this what this word actually means. You know, you go to a bookstore, for example, and you go to the philosophy section, and then you go look at the metaphysics section if they have one, and it's all flim flam. It's all nonsense. It's all woo woo. You know, last time I was in Chapters Indigo, whatever it's called, down at the Rito Center, which was a while ago because terrible philosophy section. But you go into the philosophy section of a store like that and look at metaphysics, and they've got stuff like astrology books or, you know, books about indigo children and stuff like that. You know, and I guess the reason is that metaphysics, in a certain sense, means beyond the physical, but not in that way. Metaphysics in philosophy, like the technical definition of metaphysics, is the study of reality. The name comes from Aristotle. Aristotle wrote a book called The Physics, which was about the natural world. And then he wrote some books which were called the books that came after the physics, Ta Bibliota Metaphysica. And that's metaphysics. We call those books the metaphysics, and they're just the books that come after the earlier book that was called the physics. So that's what metaphysics, that's where the term comes from. And what we do in metaphysics is we study reality, but not quite like a scientist studies reality, right? A scientist empirically investigates the natural world. But metaphysics, again, you know, philosophy being kind of a fundamental study of anything and everything, metaphysics asks fundamental questions about reality. Questions like, what are the kinds of things that exist? Of the things that exist, what are those things like, right? So here, you know, we're asking, do minds exist? What are minds? What are they like? Um, that's a metaphysical set of questions, right? Like um, a scientific set of questions would have, you know, maybe we could talk about neuroscience. So, okay, how do brains work? How are brains organized? How do signals travel around in the brain? Those are scientific questions because we can empirically investigate them. Um, but asking a question like, well, what is a mind? Um, that's something that you have to kind of do preconceptually. Um, you can't answer the question what is a mind by looking at the world. You can inform your answer to the question, but we don't have like a, like a Star Trek sort of tricorder device where we can go around scanning and go, oh, here's a mind right here, right? What a mind is kind of depends on what we decide it is, and working that out is what we do in when we do the metaphysics of mind. Yeah, it is a shame. Imagine we could just go like, ah, let's check this tree out. Scan. I feel I have to be holding some. Scan. Ah, this tree does not have a mind. I always was very envious of those people on Star Trek with their devices. They can just, ask the computer or scan something and go, oh yeah, there's I'm picking up life forms, or I'm picking up signs of mentation. If only it were that simple. So let's review some of the metaphysics of mind, some of the metaphysics of the mental, now that we know what the term means. We'll get into this more next time, but as we'll see, Rene Descartes thought that having a mind amounted to having a soul, and the soul was a thinking substance. And again, Descartes' kind of the modern originator of this idea. He's called the father of modern philosophy in the European tradition because he reinvigorated a lot of these questions. But they had been asked um, and answered in various ways in antiquity as well. So, where Descartes sees the soul as a thinking substance, Plato might have thought of it as a spiritual substance. Aristotle would have thought of it as an organizing principle. So for Aristotle, the soul isn't a substance. It's a form which informs matter. Um, Now, a lot of philosophers reject Descartes' view, which is called substance dualism. And we'll talk about the specifics of substance dualism next time. But just because they reject Cartesian substance dualism, that does not mean that they deny that we have minds. Of course, it also depends on what you mean by mind or soul. Um, it's if you take a sort of Aristotelian view, then we have souls, but those souls are not like a sort of ghost in the machine, right? Those souls are not um, going to leave the body after the death of the body. Um, Other philosophers have just limited their use of the word soul to that part of us that thinks. And that might not be a substance. Again, it might be more of a functionalist understanding of the soul, or if you're like an Aristotelian, like a hylomorphic sort of pre-functionalist understanding of the soul. So we can deny that we have souls in the Cartesian sense. That doesn't mean that we're denying that we have minds. A lot of thinkers, though, would agree with the following, Kim says. Having a mind, he writes, can be construed simply as having a certain group of properties, features, and capacities that are possessed by humans and some higher animals, but absent in things like rocks and trees. It is less misleading, therefore, to speak of mentality than of having a mind. The surface grammar of the latter abets the problematic idea of a substantival mind. Mind as an object of a special kind. So what Kim is saying here is that uh, we tend to fall into this way of thinking where a mind is something we have. Like we talk about, I think he uses examples like being out of your mind or losing one's mind. But a mind is not something that you can literally be out of or that you can lose. Like you're walking down the street and oh, there goes my mind. No, the mind is not an object that you have, but the mind is maybe more like a process. And that's why he says it's less confusing to talk about the mental and mentality than it is to talk about having a mind, or for that matter, having a soul. As if your mind or your soul inhabits this container that is your body. Kim and a lot of other philosophers of mind think that that is the wrong way to look at it. Um, the mind is not like that. And we'll canvass lots of other views as well. There are thinkers that identify the mind with the brain. So mental states are just identical to brain states. That's called identity theory. Um, so if you're an identity theorist, I guess a mind is something you have in the sense that the mind just is the brain, and the brain is something we have. People that look at mentality more like a process, or more in terms of functions, those are the functionalists. So they look at the mind as an information processing system, like a computer. And we'll talk about both of these. Each of these get their own chapter, so we'll go into much more detail. But if you identify the mind with the brain, with mental states and mental processes, if you identify those mental states and mental processes with brain states or brain processes, you're probably some variety of identity theorist. But if you liken the mind to an information processing system where mental states and mental processes are understood in terms of their causal roles within the system, then you're a functionalist. Okay, so those are, like, broadly speaking, some of the theoretical positions you can take. Let's learn some more terminology. Um, especially the next chapter. We're going to be talking about substances. And substances have properties and relations. Properties and relations together we call attributes. So this there's various different views of substance, but if this apple is a substance, it has properties and relations. So it's kind of round, it's green. I imagine if I bit into it, it would taste quite tart, and its various parts are related in certain ways, and it's got relations with other things. Right now it's out of the fruit bowl, but now it's in the fruit bowl. Okay. So those are all attributes of this apple, which is a substance. Um, that's kind of closer to the Aristotelian view of substances. You can also think of substances as those things which can exist independently. You can also think of substances as that in which properties inhere. So this is kind of like John Locke's view of substance. If I look at this apple right here, the substance for Locke is really a sort of substratum, a sort of like we know not what. But it has all these properties, right? Green, tart, kind of round, kind of shiny. Um, if you take all those properties away, you're left with this sort of substratum as substance. What is it? Well, we know not what, Locke would say. It's what sticks all the properties together. So these are all different ways you can understand what a substance is, or how to think about substances in philosophy. Um, we'll also encounter a lot of talk about mental and physical events. We've already been talking along these lines. So we've got mental and physical events, mental and physical states, processes, phenomena, occurrences, facts. This is the sort of terminology that you'll be hearing. And one way you can understand mental properties is like this. We assume, Kim states, that when a person instantiates at time t a mental property, like being in pain, then there is an event or state of that person's being in pain at t, and there's also the fact that the person is in pain at t. So I'm in pain, that's a mental property. Uh, I'm experiencing that I'm in pain, and you could say that it's a fact that I'm in pain. If I've stubbed my toe and I go, ouch, and hop up and down while clutching my foot, and I experience this pain, you could say, well, it is certainly true that Josh is in pain, so it's a fact that I'm in pain. These are all the different ways that we'll talk about all of this. Um, Before we get to mind-body supervenience, I wonder if we should have a 15-minute brain break. What do y'all think? Yes. I am throwing a lot at you, so brain break is important. I have 3:44, 3:45-ish on my clock. So maybe we come back at 4. How does that sound to everybody? And that way everybody can get up and stretch, grab a coffee, whatever else you need to do. Okay,
Sounds great.
excellent. That's what we'll do then. All right. So I will see you all in about 15 minutes. Okay, everybody. So it's 4 o'clock, so let's get back to it. Share my screen again, and we'll take off from the slide that we're on here. Oops. So, I mentioned earlier in today's lecture, as well as in our welcome lecture, that this book of Kim's um, is kind of framed in terms of the mind-body problem. But I think it's fair to say that another big theme that's going to occupy us throughout the entire book is mind-body supervenience. You'll really want to keep that in mind. So to try and come to grips or get a grasp of what mind-body supervenience is, think of something like the transporter from Star Trek. So we all, I assume, if we haven't seen any Star Trek, we must at least be familiar with the idea of the matter energy transporter. What does it do? Anybody? Anyone at all? Here we go. Yeah, yeah, exactly. It copies you, teleports you. I mean, basically, the in-universe explanation is that it converts all the matter in your body into energy, beams it somewhere, and then converts that energy back to matter and puts you back together. The idea of mind-body supervenience, I think, is nicely illustrated by Kim's example of the transporter. If you were taken apart and put back together again, a la Star Trek transporter, I think most of us would probably say that the person that rematerializes on the other end of that process would have mental states if they were physically identical to the you that beamed, down to the planet or wherever, right? Now, some of you might disagree. Actually, good. We could do a little informal investigating here. Um, let's say that I have one of these matter energy transporters, and I'm on my spaceship, and I say I can beam you down there onto the planet. If you get in the transporter, and it'll scan you and it'll take you apart, convert you to energy, beam you down there, convert you back to matter, put you back together again. How many of you think that the person who rematerializes on the planet would have mental properties? Storm says yes, thumbs up. Shannon too. Okay, good, good. And we're not dealing with identity questions, right? We're not talking like, oh, what the transporter really does is just kill you and make a copy of you, so it's not really you. Right? We're not worried about that. But the being that rematerializes is identical to you, molecule for molecule. I think a lot of us would say, well, such a creature would necessarily have a mind. In other words, a being that is physically identical to you must also be psychologically identical to you. That doesn't mean psychological identity, like, we'd have to have the exact same thoughts. You know, maybe there's a parallel universe with uh, parallel universe Josh, and he's over there, and he's had a different psychological history. Um, so he's not psychologically identical with me in that sense. Maybe he's had a different life, which has resulted his different life history is resulted in a different psychological history. Maybe in that universe, uh, uh, alternate universe Josh became I don't know, like a chef. So he has a different set of beliefs than I do. I have lots of beliefs about philosophy of mind, but in the alternate universe, I have lots of beliefs about, I don't know, haute cuisine. Um, so we wouldn't be psychologically identical in that sense, but we'd be identical in the sense that um, we would necessarily have a mind if we were physically identical with one another, right? Some people would deny this, right? Some would say that, well, maybe philosophical zombies are possible. Some people argue that philosophical zombies are conceivable and therefore possible. What is a philosophical zombie? A philosophical zombie is a being that would be physically and behaviorally identical with you, but with no mind or with no conscious experience. And these are used to argue that, um, well, consciousness is like an extra special something over and above the physical, or I suppose mentality as well. How many of you find zombies conceivable? I mean, can you conceive of a being that is physically and behaviorally identical to you? So it behaves just like you, it talks like you, it can even report mental states to you. It could say, "I'm in pain," and it's physically identical down to the molecules, right? Down to the atoms. But when it says "I'm in pain," really, there's no experience of pain. There's no mental state of being in pain. Could you conceive of such a creature? Yeah. So Matthew says no, essentially. I don't understand the idea. If everything down to the atoms is identical, it's me. It's got my brain. So we'd say for Matthew, zombies are not conceivable to you, and therefore they're not possible. And that's great. Kira, too, says sounds impossible. Grant cannot conceive of that. Shannon says yes. Well, yeah, there are people who can't experience pain, Shannon, but they have minds. So I don't mean somebody with like congenital amnesia or congenital analgesia, I think it's called, right? And they have differences in their nervous systems where they can't experience pain. They can't tell the difference between like hot and cold. Um, Kind of like that movie with Jack Quaid, right? What was it called? Novocaine. And Jack Quaid's character doesn't experience pain, and he has to like pretend he can experience pain in certain parts, right? Um, but he still has a mind, right? A zombie would be a creature without a mind, but that behaves as if it has one. Oh, like bicameral mind. Like I can't remember. Oh, what's his name? McGilchrist? Ian McGilchrist? Yeah. Emily says the notion of a parallel universe where we may exist, like you just mentioned, perhaps we are conscious in this universe, but not in the parallel universe. Yeah, reminds me of Todd Moody's zombie Earth experiment. Um, so there's Earth and there's zombie Earth, and the people on zombie Earth are behaviorally and physically indistinguishable from the people on Earth, but on zombie Earth, no minds, no consciousness. Um, Moody uses to argue that there actually would be observable differences between zombies and non-zombies at the level of culture. Um, but let's not go too far down that rabbit hole. So, if you cannot conceive of philosophical zombies, and if you agree that after taking the transporter um, uh, down to the planet, that whoever it is on that planet would have mental states, you're probably pretty comfy with the idea of mind-body supervenience. Or if we duplicated you, right? Like, there are plenty of those Star Trekky sort of examples where some transporter accident happens and somebody gets duplicated. Um, so imagine I do that to you. I say I'm going to scan you, and instead of dematerializing and rematerializing you, I'm going to scan you and then rematerialize a second you. And again, we're not talking about identity. So, who's who, who's the original? Do we have two of the same people or two new people? We don't really care about that. What's important for us is whether the duplicate would also have a mind. And people who endorse mind body supervenience would say, yes, your duplicate would have a mind. So that's mind-body supervenience, and this is the first formulation of the mind-body supervenience thesis that Kim gives us. The mental supervenes on the physical, in that things like objects, events, organisms, persons, and so on, that are exactly alike in all physical properties cannot differ with respect to mental properties. That is, physical indiscernibility entails psychological indiscernibility. So that's the first formulation of the mind-body supervenience thesis. So anything that is exactly alike in physical properties, they'd have to be exactly alike in terms of mental properties. So there's no mental or physical difference here without a physical or a material difference. So on this thesis, P zombies would not be possible. Philosophical zombies would not be possible. All right. Following me so far? Grant says the only thing I can't conceive of with teleportation is things like memories and experiences. How do those transfer over? Would I keep my memories and experiences? As such, would I experience the teleportation? Well, here's the way I think I think that I look at it. Is again kind of along the lines of supervenience. So if I'm being taken apart and put back together, or duplicated, then my brain is being perfectly duplicated. So all of the connections between all my neurons, the way they're all wired up together and the way they talk to each other, that would also be preserved. That would be perfectly duplicated. So there wouldn't be any physical differences between me and me at time 1 and me at time 2 after transporting, or between me and my duplicate. So so I would expect that when I rematerialize on Mars or wherever, I would still have all my memories. Unless something happened, maybe Scotty like hits the wrong button and smooths out my brain, and now I lose my memories, and now I'm like another person. Um, you know, but yeah, it sounds like you say, I don't think a philosophical zombie could exist. So anything that is physically identical with you would be psychologically or mentally identical. Again, not in the sense that you'd be the exact same person necessarily, right? Like, so there could be a duplicate of me who lives another life, in some alternate universe, or maybe I get duplicated and now one of me continues to be a philosophy professor and the other decides to go and become a chef, right? We would be psychologically different in that we'd have different mental states, but we would be the same in the sense that we have all of the physical stuff, all of the physical events, processes, and states are there such that the duplicate would have a mind. I haven't seen the movie Astro Boy, but I did see the Canadian dubbed anime when I was like 5 years old on the television. I guess Astro
Uh,
Boy has implanted memories. Is that how that works? Uh,
oh, sorry, Professor, but yeah, this what you're saying exactly reminds me of a movie I watched, but I couldn't remember what it was called, and it was exactly what like you we're talking about. It was
Yeah.
about like recreating someone exactly like you, but like with the same memory and the same mind, but they don't become you.
Yeah. There's a lot of examples like that in science. Science fiction is a great means of thinking our way through these questions, and I don't want to get bogged down with questions about identity because that's like a whole other can of worms. But um, yeah, like Shannon says, it's there are some episodes of Black Mirror like this too. Um, would that also prove we don't have free will? Well, so you know what, Grant? I I don't want to touch that right now, because we're going to have a whole topic on mental causation. But I will say that it's a very real question for philosophers, because if everything mental is ultimately, dependent in some important way on the physical, then that gets us back to the problem of mental causation. So if the mental supervenes on the physical, there's a worry that while the physical can causally affect the mental cannot causally affect anything else. So that's called epiphenomenalism. And if that's true, that has some pretty frightening implications, when it comes to whether we have free will. So that's all I'll say for now. You're right to be asking that question. I just want to save it for, when we talk about mental causation and epiphenomenalism. But yeah, you're absolutely right to be thinking of that. So mind body supervenience one, just to reiterate, the mental supervenes on the physical in that anything that's alike in all physical properties, so object A and object B, if they're exactly alike in terms of physical properties, they cannot differ with respect to mental properties. So there's no mental difference without a physical material difference, and this seems to mean that philosophical zombies are not a possibility. So that's, the first supervenience thesis. The second formulation of mind-body supervenience, is something that we call strong supervenience. This is a little bit more technical. So mind-body supervenience 2 says the mental supervenes on the physical in that if anything X has mental property M, there is a physical property P such that X has P, and necessarily any object that has P has M. Now, that's a little abstract, right? X's, M's, P's, what? Well, just think of it like this: if you're having a, if you're like, a little intimidated by this way of carving it up, our X is our being. So X might be. Let me draw a little arrow here. Let's say X is me. I'm just gonna. You guys can call me Josh, by the way. You don't have to call me Professor. This is Josh. Josh is our X, okay? And Josh has mental property M, which is, I don't know, let's say I'm hungry. So I have mental property M. So if I have mental property M, there must be a physical property P such that I also have P. Now, physical property P, let's say physical property P is an empty stomach. I got my hunger hormones. When you're hungry, I think the body uses little chemical messengers or hormones to signal that it's hungry. And I have this feeling of being hungry, and then I have, that supervenes on like my stomach contents, my blood sugar levels, my little hunger hormones are doing. Those are all P. Okay. Well, we'll talk about rocks in a minute, but just for, illustrative purposes, now we've got P, our supervenience base. And so any, object that has P must necessarily have M. So if I X have mental state M, that has a supervenience base P, and anything that has P will have M. So right now I have P. I have empty stomach, low blood sugar, hungry hormones going around telling me eat something. Maybe I'm salivating, like one of Pavlov's dogs, right? Um, any other object, like you, who has the same supervenience base, will have the same mental state, subjective experience of hunger. So P is our supervenience base. And on strong supervenience, anything that has P must necessarily have M. Now notice that mind-body supervenience 2 entails mind-body supervenience 1. So if I go back, oh, my little drawings are still there. Um, so anything that's alike in physical properties cannot differ with respect to mental properties. Mind-body supervenience 2 entails mind-body supervenience 1. That is to say, it logically entails it. Let's get rid of the drawings. Okay. Any questions so far before we get to global supervenience? Does that mean there would be another formula to explain it? Well, okay, so let's go back to the example of like somebody who cannot experience pain. Um, so the simple supervenience base are are C fibers firing or C fiber activation. So let's just say, for example's sake, that um, I stub my toe, my C fibers activate. That's my supervenience base. So any being whose C fibers are activated, who has that supervenience base, would also be in a state of pain. But let's say I have that weird condition where I don't experience pain. Maybe that's because my C fibers don't fire, or because I don't have C fibers, right? I'm not that kind of doctor, right? I don't know why this happens, or how it happens. But we could say that in cases where those people, they don't experience pain, they are lacking that supervenience base. Make sense? Well, strong supervenience is different in that it's not exactly saying the same thing as the first formulation, but the first formulation follows from this formulation. That's the difference. And to go back to Grant, if a rock has mental property M, right, I think a lot of people would just deny that. Of course, we could anthropomorphize rocks. We can say, like, that rock wants to, imagine like some kind of wily coyote sort of scenario with a rock balancing on another rock and it looks like it's going to tip over. You might look at it and say, oh, that rock wants to tip over. But we're anthropomorphizing the rock, right? Or I suppose we could be talking about the rock, the person. The Rock wants to sit here and do nothing. Dwayne Johnson just feels like sitting and doing nothing. But I assume you mean rocks, like that are on the ground. So, um, those rocks don't have mental states, but I assume that Dwayne the Rock Johnson does have mental states. Um, so, hopefully that answers all those questions. Now, another formulation, global supervenience. So, mind body supervenience 3 or global supervenience says the mental supervenes on the physical in that worlds that are alike in all physical respects are alike in all mental respects as well. In fact, worlds that are physically alike are exactly alike overall. And here we don't, by the world, when philosophers say the world, they don't just mean the planet Earth. They mean the universe or the cosmos. They mean the whole of existence. That is the world. Um, so what this says is that in physical worlds that are exactly alike in all physical respects, they would be alike in all mental respects as well. So imagine there are, during the Big Bang, maybe there's a mirror universe that began when our universe began. Imagine they were all exactly alike, and we just happened to get two duplicate universes. Um, well, Josh in that universe would be psychologically identical with Josh in this universe. Or maybe there's like a multiverse sort of scenario where the universes are different in terms of what's historically unfolded, but otherwise they're physically identical. So I travel through a wormhole to another universe, and I see that even though that world has a different history than ours, there are still people who are physically like the people in my universe. And if Mind Body Supervenience 3 is true, those people would also have minds. It wouldn't be like zombie Earth. There couldn't be a zombie Earth. So Supervenience 2, Grant says Supervenience 2 is locally saying that X is something that is not everything else around it. It is a separate entity, while 3 is saying X is everything well, there's no X in 3. So strong supervenience is talking about individual entities. Supervenience 3 is talking about absolutely everything. So there's no X. It's talking about all of the X's. So if global supervenience is true, there could be another universe where, again, maybe I've had a different life history. I'm not a professor. I'm a chef or a firefighter or something, right? Doesn't matter. So I'm different in the sense that I've got a different psychological history, but I'm similar enough to Josh, this Josh, that I would have a mind. You know, I'd have the brain and the nervous system, and it would operate physically the same way that my brain and nervous system in this universe operate. So it would necessarily, that other universe version of me would have a mind. So that's again why two is stronger than one. Mind body supervenience 2 implies or entails mind body supervenience 1. And we can also see why 3 is called global supervenience, because it's about everything in the universe or in an alternate universe. Whereas 2 is about particular objects or particular entities. That's why 3 is global. Make sense? Okay. I'm not getting anyone saying it doesn't make sense. Grant says thumbs up. Thank you, Grant. So that's supervenience. So those are three different versions of the supervenience thesis that it's going to be important to keep in mind. All of them are going to be important to keep in mind as we go. Now let's talk about materialism and physicalism. Kim writes, materialism is the doctrine that all things that exist in the world are bits of matter or aggregate bits of matter. There is no thing that isn't a material thing. No no transcendental beings. No Hegelian absolutes, no immaterial minds. Physicalism is the contemporary successor to materialism. Um, I'm going to use physicalism. Some folks still use materialism, but the reason why I prefer physicalism is because materialism is a little bit older and hasn't really kept up with what we've learned about the physical world. By the physical world, I mean the natural world, like the world that is studied by physicists. Um, so materialism comes out of the early modern period and the scientific revolution. So the period of time that Descartes was working in, Galileo, Kepler, and later Newton, right? They saw the world, and again, the world means the universe, as matter in motion. Um, and it's a view that, again, you can connect back to the ancient Greeks. I mean, the ancient Greek atomists in the tradition of Democritus. Like Democritus thought everything was atoms and void. Atoms Of course, the atoms of Democritus were a little bit different from how we understand what atoms are today. But Democritus thought that um, fundamentally everything was like tiny little bits of matter that moved around. And this idea carried forward all the way in through the scientific revolution, where, the universe was matter in motion, and the motions of the matter are governed by these law-like causal relations that today we call the laws of nature or the laws of physics. Um, and that's great. That's true. But it's not the whole story, right? Um, Once we get into the 19th century and the 20th century and the 21st century, we start grappling with, and maybe even a little bit earlier than this. I know that there was some debate going back between like Newton and Christian Huygens from the Netherlands about whether light is a wave or a particle, right? Um, but once we started talking about electromagnetic waves, electromagnetic fields, gravitational fields, right? We've got this notion of a field in physics, which isn't made of anything, right? Um, but it still exerts an influence. So, if I'm like orbiting the Earth, I'm in Earth's gravitational field, right? There's no gravity particles, right? There's no gravitons sticking to me, keeping me in orbit. Rather, I am in a field of influence caused by the mass of the Earth affecting space-time in such a way. Um, And so not everything is made of matter, but there are other physical things like energy, like force fields, like properties, like mass, spin, charge, um, which aren't literally made of anything, but they're still features of the physical or the natural world. So now we talk about physicalism, not materialism. Yeah, we stand on the shoulders of giants, don't we, Grant? Now some physicalists, so physicalists are people who think that the only things that exist are physical things, matter, energy, and their properties. The only things that are fundamentally real are are the kinds of things that are studied by physicists. That's what physicalism means. And most philosophers are physicalists. Not all, but a lot. The difference is on the difference tends to be what kind of physicalist are you, right? So there are like non-reductive physicalists, for example. There are reductive and there are non-reductive physicalists. So the non-reductive physicalists would say that there might be non-physical properties, like mental properties, or moral properties or aesthetic properties, and they supervene on physical properties. So we talked about mind body supervenience. Think of aesthetic supervenience here. So, what's a beautiful work of art? I don't know about visual art. Anybody got what's a great example? Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly due to that, although another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of those giants who made those discoveries did not think of themselves as scientists or what we called, I mean, they thought of themselves as scientists in that they were studying the natural world. They called themselves natural philosophers. Um, and it's interesting, like over time, as these subfields of natural philosophy have kind of become their own branches of science, it's almost like philosophy as a distinct discipline has shrunk because there's less for philosophers to talk about because they've worked out how to talk about the natural world, right? Um, so science and like nowadays we think of science and philosophy as very different kinds of things, but for most of the history of science and philosophy, that wasn't true. Um, so yeah, Okay, yeah, Starry Night or the Mona Lisa. Those are great examples. Let's go with Starry Night because I like space. Um, so we could say that the aesthetic properties supervene on the physical properties. Imagine I'm an art transportation specialist on my Starship Enterprise, and okay, we have to take Starry Night somewhere else to the museum on Mars, right? So what do? I beam it up, take the painting apart, convert it to energy, put it back together perfectly. It's still beautiful. Uh, if you believe it's still beautiful, maybe that's because these aesthetic properties are supervening on the physical properties of the painting. Or maybe I hit the wrong button and now I've got two Starry Nights. Um, if they are exactly alike in terms of their physical properties, then non-reductive physicalists would say they are then exactly alike in terms of their aesthetic properties. They're both beautiful paintings. You might get into an argument about which one is the real Starry Night and which one is the duplicate, and that's fine. That's a separate question. But non-reductive physicalists would agree they're both beautiful paintings. Yeah, it is. It is quite like the ship of Theseus. I think that's what you mean, right? The Theseus paradox. Which one is the ship, or when does it cease to be the ship? These are slightly different questions, right? They're questions related to the metaphysics of identity rather than the metaphysics of mind, but they're still fun to think about. So that's the idea, right? You get the idea. These non-physical properties are real in that they supervene on physical properties. Without the physical properties, you don't have the moral, aesthetic, or mental properties. That's what non-reductive physicalists would say. Um, a lot of people think that the mind-body supervenience thesis also affirms mind-body dependence. Kim says on page 12, many philosophers regard the supervenience thesis as affirming a relation of dependence or determination between the mental and the physical. That is, mental properties a given thing has depend on or are determined by the physical properties it has. And yeah, that's to continue here. Our psychological character is wholly determined by our physical nature. Um, and this is pretty straightforward. I think a lot of people would countenance something like this. For example, like famous case that's often used in psychology courses is the case of Phineas Gage. Anybody know about Phineas Gage? He was a railway foreman in the 19th century, and one of his jobs as a foreman was helping to blast, use explosives to clear the way for railway tracks. Yes, the pole through his skull. Exactly, Tristan. So, um, how this would be done is you drill a hole into the rock, and then you'd put your explosives in there, and you would tamp them down, basically compact them into the hole with something called a tamping iron, which is basically a big long spike with a flat thing on the end, so you can like really jam that dynamite down in there. Something happened where a spark ignited the explosives, and that tamping iron basically became like a missile and shot out and went through Gage's skull, kind of like in here and out there, and it damaged his frontal cortex. He survived. He survived, but he suffered brain damage, and as a result of the brain damage, his personality changed after the accident. So that's one example. Other examples, mind-altering substances. Um, if you take certain mind-altering substances, uh, your mental states change. Think of anesthetics, right? You go to the dentist, you got to get your wisdom teeth out. They put you under, give you some anesthetic, and you lose consciousness because the physical properties of your brain have been altered, right? So that's one example there. Or maybe you're sleepy and you drink some coffee. I think caffeine likes to work on your acetylcholine receptors, maybe a little bit on the dopamine system. If you really like coffee, it probably engages the pleasure reward system, but dopamine is not the mechanism by which caffeine makes you feel less sleepy. But you get the idea, right? By altering your brain chemistry, you alter your mental state. So that's mind body dependence. What's going on mentally depends on what's going on physically in the body, which implies a sort of minimal physicalism, right? Where in some important sense, everything mental depends upon the physical, which here means the brain and the nervous system. There are some other important ideas you're going to want to keep in mind as we make our way through this course as well. So one is substance physicalism. This is how Kim puts it. Substance physicalism says, quote, all that exists in this world are bits of matter in space-time and aggregate structures composed of bits of matter. There's nothing else in the space-time world. Well, there are properties, right? Not just matter and bits of matter. This is actually materialism, the way that Kim's put it here, um, not physicalism. But there are force fields, right? Electromagnetic fields, gravitational fields, stuff like that. Um, um, that's physicalism. That's substance physicalism. The only kind of substance that exists is physical substance. And as I said before, most philosophers of mind are physicalists. Not all, but most contemporary philosophers of mind are physicalists in some sense or another. That doesn't mean to say they agree on everything, though, as we'll see. Um, there are different types of physicalism, as I've sketched out here on this slide. So Grant says substance physicalism would say that beliefs are physical. Uh, some types would. Well, I guess, yeah. I mean, well, actually, this is a good chance to we can try and hash this out by talking about these types of physicalism, non-reductive and reductive. We'll try and hash out the answer to your question. So, property dualism is also non-reductive physicalism is also known as property dualism. And Kim says the psychological properties of a system are distinct from and irreducible to its physical properties. Now, this is not substance dualism. When Kim says almost no one is a dualist, he means almost no one is a substance dualist. But there are property dualists. So, to go back to the chat and Grant's question, so substance physicalism would say that beliefs are physical. Um, a property dualist would say no. Mental properties are not physical and are not reducible to physical properties. They're um, they're an extra kind of property that might emerge out of physical interactions in the brain, say, but they're not reducible to those interactions. But reductive physicalists would say, yes, beliefs are physical. Why? Well, they say psychological properties or kinds or types are reducible to physical properties or kinds or types. That is, psychological properties and kinds are physical properties and kinds. There are only properties of one sort exemplified in this world, and they are physical properties. That's reductive physicalism or type physicalism. Um, and when we talk about identity theory, we'll expand on this. But identity theory is a sort of type physicalism, where mental states are not something over and above the physical states of the brain, but rather they just are identical with states of the brain. There's a less strong a less strong version of non-reductive physicalism called token physicalism. Um, the most, I guess, obvious kind being functionalism. And we'll look at that later in the course. But yeah, to answer your question, Grant, non-reductive physicalists, I think, would say no, beliefs are not physical. Reductive physicalists would say ultimately, yes, they are. Yeah. Good, good. And then we've got to keep in mind that there are lots of different varieties of mental phenomena. So there are sensations, for example. These are mental events caused by features of the world which impinge on our sense organs and our nervous system. Sensations are generally taken to be prior to perceptions. Sensation is like detecting the difference between hot and cold, light and dark, solid and liquid, and etc. Perceptions are mental representations of features of the world. So perceptions are like full-blown conceptual representations of what is happening. Like if you showed me this coffee cup, if I was blindfolded and you gave me this cup, I could be like, oh, it's got a certain shape, it's hard, it's kind of warm. Okay, that's sensation. Perception is when I realize, oh, it's a coffee cup, and I actually conceptualize what it is that I'm sensing. So perceptions are like full-blown mental representations of features of the world. The world can also include ourselves. So like if I can sense I can sense that I've got an itch. I can perceive that I've got a mosquito bite, right? Um, I can even, in a sense, perceive the contents of my own mind. That's called introspection. Um, our mental lives seem to have a sort of subjective, phenomenal, qualitative aspect to them, and we call these aspects of mentality qualia, or quale for singular. Um, well, perceptions are formed, I would say, by applying concepts to sensations. Um, that's kind of a philosophical answer. But sensation is more simplistic, like an earthworm can sense when it's wet versus when it's dry. I don't know that an earthworm can perceive that it's raining, right? And yeah, optical illusions kind of trick up our systems, right? So that maybe we can talk about illusions at some point. But back to the apple. Okay, the apple is green. That is a quale. When I see and perceive the greenness, and I have an experience of this green apple, the green is a quale. The the solidity of the apple, it's still pretty ripe. It hasn't started going all soft, so that solidity, that's a quale. Um, when you go out in the morning and it's still kind of chilly and you go, ooh, it's cold, that is a quale, right? The smell of coffee is a quale. These are all qualia, these subjective phenomenal. By phenomenal, I mean there's something that it's like to experience them. These are qualia. So those would be important to keep in mind when we talk about consciousness toward the end of the course. Then there are mental states that we can attribute to people. These are linguistically formatted, and we put them in sentences or propositions that feature that clause, and we call these propositional attitudes. So a proposition is a statement about the world that has a truth value. So a proposition is what's a good one? It is raining. That's a proposition. It's a statement about the world, and it has a truth value. It's either raining or it's not. So it is raining is either true or false when I utter it. Right now, it happens to be false. It's not raining, at least not where I am. So I can say, it is not raining in North Bay. That is a true proposition. Propositional attitudes are linguistically formatted attitudes that we take toward those propositions. So I believe that it is raining. That's a propositional attitude. Belief is a propositional attitude toward the proposition. It's an attitude of belief. It's an attitude of belief toward that proposition. You believe that it is true that it is raining. Notice that if I held that belief now, I would have a false belief. So beliefs and desires are important propositional attitudes. Knowledge is a type of propositional attitude. Knowledge is a special kind of belief. So knowledge is a well-justified, true belief. So if I have the belief it is not raining in North Bay, and I form that belief because I looked out and saw that there are no raindrops falling, and I checked the weather map on my phone and saw that there was no precipitation currently happening, no precipitation forecast, and I formed the belief it is not raining, well, now I've got knowledge because my belief is true and it's justified by good evidence. So these are all types of propositional attitudes. These are also these propositional attitudes have what we call intentionality. Um, they have content. They're about something. I'll say more about this aboutness in a moment. Then, of course, there are affective states like moods or emotions. Um, each of these is a type of feeling. Um, and some sensations and perceptions are feeling like as well. Like hunger. You can feel hungry. You can feel pain. But these aren't emotions. Um, a mood is sort of long term, and moods are a lot less intentional. Emotions are episodic, so they're short term, and they are intentional. And as I said, moods and emotions are feelings, but not all feelings are moods or emotions. So hunger or pain are not emotions, they're feelings. Happiness is a feeling, but it's more than just a feeling, it is an emotion. Then there are intentions or volitions, right? These could be propositional attitudes too, like Josh decided that he would have pizza for breakfast. Um, so I can express that attitude propositionally, and it's intentional. It's intentional in the sense that it's about something, but it's intentional in the sense that it's like it's something that causes action. Like I ate pizza for breakfast because I wanted to. Darn it. Um, and we could talk of other mental phenomena, character traits, personality traits, intelligence, habits, um, talents. The list goes on. And that should make us ask whether there is a mark of the mental. Is there some criterion? And, notice that this is kind of getting us back where we started. Is there some criterion that can help us distinguish between entities that have minds and entities that do not have minds? How do we know when we have a mind? What are some of the things that might let us know? Well, some possibilities include these epistemological criteria. So epistemology is a branch of philosophy that means like theory of knowledge or study of knowledge. We ask questions like, what is knowledge and how do you know when you know something? That's epistemology. So an epistemological criteria of mentality would be something that has to do with knowledge. Um, maybe one mark of the mental is a direct or immediate knowledge, right? Like let's say that I have a toothache. I don't have to like infer that I have a toothache. I just know, ow, I have a toothache. This sort of direct or immediate, uh, immediately apparent to me that I have a toothache. Or if I'm looking at a red circle or a green apple, like I don't have to be like, what color is this? Inspect the apple. No, if I'm normally sighted, I don't have color blindness or anything, then I just know, oh, it's green. It's direct and immediate. So maybe the directness or immediateness of our knowledge of our own mental states is a good mark of the mental. Then again, sometimes we can be unaware of our mental states. Um, how many of you are aware of how your socks feel on your feet right now? Show of hands. Were you before I said that? Were you aware? Now that I mention it, exactly. Well, for those of you who are wearing socks, some of you might have been aware. Some of you might not. Yeah, it's kind of like manual breathing, or yeah, automatically. It kind of falls into the background. Like you might know, oh yeah, I put socks on this morning, but you're not aware of the sensation until somebody points it out to you. So were you not aware of having socks? Well, I don't know. Maybe another epistemological mark of the mental is a sort of the privacy or the first person privilege of our mental states. So, and this is kind of a clumsy way to put it, maybe, but there's a sort of mindness to my thoughts and to my experiences. They're mine, not yours. And yours are yours, not mine. Hmm. Yeah, Grant, good. I like it when people post videos of their dogs with those boots. The dogs can definitely tell, because they're like walking weird. My dog does a handstand if we try to, well, I guess she doesn't have hands, but if you put boots on her back feet, she will do a handstand and walk around on her two front paws. It's very weird. Um, Neurodivergence can cause unintentional awareness. Yes, that is true. So, neurodivergent folks have nervous systems, brains and nervous systems that work a little bit differently from, so-called neurotypical folks. And so, perhaps somebody puts their socks on and forgets, oh yeah, I'm wearing socks. I know because I remember putting them on, but I don't notice I'm wearing them until my philosophy professor points it out. But maybe a neurodivergent person who has like different sensory processing, maybe they feel the socks all the time and they got to wear like pretty comfortable socks or maybe no socks, right? So that is true. And maybe it's another reason why direct or immediate knowledge might work as a potential mark of the mental, but there seems to be like some individual differences here. Um, so I don't know. I don't know how good of a mark of the mental is it? We don't know. But yeah, first person privilege. There's a mindness to my thoughts and experiences. Sometimes this can get a little weird. In certain cases, you might not experience thoughts or sensations as your own. This happens to people with schizophrenia, for example. Some people with schizophrenia report that their thoughts have been inserted from somewhere else. Their thoughts are not their own, but perhaps they've been put into my mind by aliens or the government, right? This is where the whole tinfoil hat thing comes from, right? They won't read my mind and put thoughts in my head if I protect my mind with tinfoil. That's where that comes from, believe it or not. Uh, of course, you can also experience his sensations, um, or you can kind of trick your brain, like in cases like the rubber hand illusion. So this is something that like psychologists will do, where they get you to look at you've got your real hand underneath a barrier, and then in your sleeve is a rubber hand, and somebody will stimulate your hand at the same time as they stimulate the rubber hand, and you're only looking at the rubber hand, and it starts to feel that the rubber hand is your hand. And then they'll take a hammer and like smash the rubber hand, and people will pull away like this as if their hand is about to be hit, even though their hand is like over there, and it's the rubber hand that the experimenter is aiming for with her hammer. So you know, some weird stuff can happen, but yeah, maybe accepting these exceptions, um, there does seem to be a mineness to my thoughts and my experiences. Or maybe infallibility or transparency is an epistemological mark of the mental. After all, my knowledge of my own mental states is infallible and incorrigible. I cannot be mistaken about whether I'm experiencing them or what the experiences are. I can be mistaken, like I can be mistaken about lots of things. Okay, I can experience illusions, hallucinations, delusions, but I can't be wrong about what those thoughts are about and who they're happening to. Kind of, yeah. Kind of like Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. That was his way of being certain that he exists, even though an evil genius might be deceiving him about everything else. It's like trying to think of an example. Well, like an optical illusion, right? I might think I'm perceiving a three-dimensional object when in fact it's only a two-dimensional representation, but I can't be wrong about the content of what I'm perceiving. I might even know, like okay, let's get to the chat and I'll try and come up with a concrete example. Well, that's solipsism. Yeah, you're describing a position called solipsism. And maybe we can talk about that next time when we talk about Descartes. But solipsism is the idea that the only thing that exists, or the only thing that you can know with certainty, is your own mind. And it's related to the problem of other minds. How do I know that there are other minds out there in the world? Descartes was accused of solipsism, in fact. That's kind of what we're talking about. What I'm talking about here is like, okay, an optical illusion. Uh, like the Mueller-Lyer illusion. You know that one. I'm sure you know that one. It's the one with the maybe I can draw it somewhere. I don't have any paper, or there might be some paper here. It's going to be very crude, but with the Mueller-Lyer illusion, you've got these two lines. This is actually hard to draw because as I'm drawing, I'm kind of giving myself the illusion. But you've seen it. It's like this, right? Where you've got these two lines, and one of them looks longer than the other, but the lines are actually the same length. Um, so you might know you know how it works. Like, oh, I know the lines are the same length, but you are experiencing them as different lengths. Um, so even though like you could be mistaken that those lines are different lengths when in fact they're the same. You cannot be mistaken about how it appears to you. Um, and maybe I don't know. Maybe our mental states are transparent, um, but I don't know. I wonder. After all, I mean, there's a heck of a lot going on unconsciously that we're not consciously aware of. Maybe mentality is non-spatial. Maybe that's how we know what the mental is. We'll talk about this more next time, but Descartes believed that the mind is a non-extended thinking substance, which he called in Latin res cogitans, thinking substance, or a thinking thing. But bodies, the human body, as well as physical objects out there, like, tables and coffee cups and, um, you know, chairs like the one I'm sitting in. Those are all bodies for Descartes. They're made of extended substance, or res extensa, an extended thing. Uh, it's extended in that it takes up space, it has mass, but it's non-thinking, it's non-mental. So maybe the mental is non-spatial. To really take this seriously, you'd have to take seriously the possibility of substance dualism, and as I've already said, very few people do. So I don't know how appealing this will be to any of you. It's certainly not super appealing to me. Um, the big candidate for the mark of the mental is intentionality. Grant says, is there anything that shows that religious people are more substance dualist than non-religious people? Yeah, I mean, at least if you're talking about most of the Abrahamic religions, that's basically substance dualism. It's tricky with Judaism. Early Judaism doesn't really have the sort of idea of the soul that we find in Christianity or Islam. And that's actually because of Plato. Because Christianity, some of the early Christian thinkers were also Neoplatonic philosophers, and they had read Plato. And so some of his views kind of sneak into the early Christian understanding of the mind and body relationship, in the same way that some of Aristotle's views kind of appear in like medieval Christian theology. Uh, and arguably for the same reason, that's why we get the views of soul in Islam that we do, because when Europe was in the Dark Ages, everybody over at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, they were reading Aristotle and all those guys and translating it into Arabic and doing really cool Islamic philosophy with it. Um, and Descartes himself was a Catholic who was educated at a Jesuit college. The Jesuits or the Brotherhood of Jesus are like I always describe them as like philosopher priests, um, which is a massive oversimplification. But um, yeah, by and large, I think that religious people tend to be substance dualist, but non-religious people, to me, non-religious people includes spiritual people. So they might not have a religion, but they might still believe in an immaterial soul. Um, and so I I think that religious people, at least, if at least if you're talking like Abrahamic religion, yeah, they tend to have views that are quite similar to substance dualism. But non-religious people also kind of succumb to dualism. Even people who deny substance dualism have trouble letting go of some of their dualist intuitions about the mind. This is a big theme in the work of Daniel Dennett. He'll say, like, look, no one's a dualist, but we still fall into these dualist traps when we try to think about the mind. Like, we still think about things happening in a mind. Or we think that maybe that there's a time and a place at which, during which and at which things might enter or exit consciousness. These are like dualistic assumptions. Yeah, like okay, that's a good way. Yeah, Jim Davies, Grant says. So Professor Davies says, yeah, like we think of the mind as like a container, where the mind is really more like an unfolding process, not like a thing that stuff can be in. And Dennett would say if you're doing that, what you're actually doing is you're showing your Cartesian materialism. So you're a materialist, You deny being a dualist, but you still have a lot of these Cartesian sort of substance dualism sort of assumptions. So even people who vehemently deny being dualists still have to be careful not to fall into these traps. It's just that, and I think this really has to do with the way that our minds develop as we develop as people, like as we go from like infancy to childhood to adolescence and the mind develops, we learn to look at the world and categorize things in the world along the lines that Kim says here. We learn that there are things that are alive and that are not alive. We learn that there are things with minds and things without minds, and we kind of grow up and develop as like little natural born dualists. So yeah, well, I think you tend to see dualism or dualist views in religious people. It's certainly not limited to people who are like, subscribers of any particular religion. We all have these kinds of biases, and it's probably due to the way that our minds develop. I hope that answers your question. Maybe intentionality can be a criterion of the mental states have intentionality, right? They have content. If an intentional state is a state that's about something, right? Like if I believe that there's pizza in the fridge, my belief is about there being pizza in the fridge. If I desire to eat the pizza, I'm desiring the pizza that's in the fridge, not the pizza that's, at a Pizza Hut in Europe. No, I want the pizza that's in my fridge. So the pizza that's in my fridge is the content of these beliefs and desires. That's what makes them intentional states. And it was Franz Brentano, an Austrian philosopher, who argued that intentionality is the mark of the mental. He wrote, every mental phenomenon is characterized by what the scholastics of the Middle Ages called the intentional, or mental, inexistence of an object, and what we might call, though not wholly unambiguously, reference to a content, direction toward an object, which is not to be understood here as meaning a thing, or immanent objectivity. Every mental phenomenon includes something as object within itself, although they do not all do so in the same way. In presentation, something is presented. In judgment, something is affirmed or denied. In love, loved. In hate, hated. In desire, desired, and so on. So it's really, this is a sort of long way of saying that intentionality is the mark of the mental, because all of these different kinds of mental states have content, intentional content. They're about something. You can't have a belief that's not about anything. You can't have a desire that's not about anything, right? So the idea that intentionality is the mark of the mental is called Brentano's thesis. And we can divide it up into two types: referential intentionality and content intentionality. Referential intentionality says that what our mental states says that our mental states or really deals with what our mental states refer to, or what they are directed toward out there in the world. So this coffee cup, for example, I have a perception of it. That's referential intentionality, because my perception is about this coffee cup that's out in the world. And then there's content intentionality, which deals with the contents of our beliefs, desires, and other mental states. So referential intentionality is I guess more about not strictly speaking about perception, but it kind of tends that way. Um, and content intentionality deals with the content of our beliefs and our desires and other mental states. So that's two ways of kind of dividing up intentionality, two subtypes. Another way that I like to illustrate intentionality and the notion of the mental representation is using this painting by Rene Magritte. This is called The Treachery of Images. I'm sure you've seen this painting before. It's a Dadaist or surrealist. I'm actually not sure. You'd have to ask like an art person. But, it's from the early 20th century. Um, what does this say here? Well, it's French. It says, "This is not a pipe." But what do you mean it's not a pipe? Is that not a pipe? What do you mean it's not a pipe? Who can help me make sense of this? Yeah, Grant, good idea. Mentioning Socrates and the forms. Yeah, um, the words painted rather than the pipe itself. Yeah. Well, it's not. It's it. I mean, you can believe or disbelieve the words. I mean, but I'm glad you mentioned the theory of forms. Um, yeah, or the duck rabbit. Yeah, a duck and a rabbit. Um, this so Plato would say the forms are the most real things, right? The intelligible forms or the ideas are what are the most real things, and everything else is a mere shadow on the cave wall, right? Plato would say this is like a representation of a pipe. This is mimesis. Yeah, like Simbarashi is that? I hope I'm getting your name right. If I ever mispronounce somebody's name, please tell me. Simba. Okay. Please tell me if I ever butcher your name. One time I had a student, I butchered her name for months before she told me, and then I just felt terrible. So if I butcher your name, please tell me right away so that I do not butcher your name. Okay? But Simba, you're right. It is a representation of a pipe. It's not a pipe. It's a representation of a pipe. That's what it means to say that this is not a pipe. You look at it and you go, oh, it's clearly a pipe. Well, no, it's not actually a pipe. It's just a painting of a pipe. Um, to say that our mental states have content means that our mental states are representational, like Magritte's painting is a representation of a pipe and not the pipe itself. Our mental representations are like this too. They are, our perceptions, our thoughts, beliefs, desires, experiences, emotions are all mental representations, mental states that represent something in the world. And it's by virtue of the fact that they do this representational thing that they have content. They also have justification and correctness conditions. So you can be wrong. We can have misrepresentations. I might see something off in the distance and be mistaken about what it is. Um, you know, so I have a misperception. Like I think there's a human being out in that field there, but it's actually just a scarecrow, right? Like that kind of a thing. So there's justification and correctness conditions. A correctness condition means that my representation, my mental representation, has to be veridical or correct. And the justification conditions are about like, the reasons why I have the mental state that I do. Um, I don't want to get too into the epistemological weeds here, but just know that we can be wrong. We can have false beliefs. We can misperceive things in the environment, right? Because we don't hit those justification and correctness conditions. Okay, any questions? Any questions before we wrap up? I guess I just want to make sure that we understand justification and correctness. I do want to kind of get into the epistemological weeds a little bit. Let's say that I learn that Ottawa is the capital of Canada by taking my, I don't know, what's it called? My Canadian studies class in elementary school, right? So I form the belief that Ottawa is the capital of Canada, and I have a justified true belief. So it's true, so it's correct because Ottawa is the capital of Canada. So my mental representation, Ottawa is the capital of Canada, is correct. And it's also well justified. I have learned it from a reputable teacher. And then I go on the field trip and I'm on the bus driving into Ottawa. Welcome to the nation's capital. Oh, okay. Now I've seen it with my own eyes, right? Um, what would it mean if my justification conditions were if the justification conditions were not met. Oh, I don't know. Maybe I don't learn that Ottawa is the capital from a reputable teacher. Maybe I don't see from with my own eyes. Maybe maybe I hit my head and have a vision where a genie tells me that Ottawa is the capital. Well, okay, so I form the belief. Genie appears. Hey, Ottawa's the capital of Canada. And so I form the belief that Ottawa is the capital city of Canada. Well, I'm correct, but I'm not very well justified. I might also have really good reasons for believing something, but I might be completely incorrect. Um, Before Eratosthenes worked out the shape of the Earth, it would have been, pretty reasonable to believe that the Earth is flat rather than spheroid. Um, just based on our evidence from our senses. Um, so I might have been had a well justified belief that just wasn't correct. So, all right, question. What property do all mental phenomena have in common that unites them all as mental? Could it be intentionality? Could it be non-spatiality? Or some of the epistemic criteria we looked at? Could be. Out of all of those, I think the best candidate is probably intentionality, but others might say that it could also be consciousness. Some would say that mentality is representational in character, so it's not just that they're content bearing states, it's that they're representational states as well. We're going to keep revisiting these as we go. So, if you feel like you don't know what the best candidate for the mark of the mental is, don't worry about it, because we're going to continue to pose these questions as we go. That's about it for today. On Wednesday, we're going to start looking at substance dualism. So we're going to talk about Rene Descartes. Um, Definitely read Kim Chapter 2, Mind as Immaterial Substance. You'll want to have read that to follow my lectures. We will stick pretty close to Kim again next time. And I also think that it would be a really good idea and might even be fun if you read the meditations. You don't have to read all of them, but if you decide to read them, definitely read the first two. They're an easy read, classic, classic work in the history of philosophy. Descartes is a great writer, um, and it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to read the sixth meditation as well. You can understand what Kim is going to do in this chapter without having read Descartes, but the primary source is the best, and I think you should just read Descartes. So definitely read Kim chapter 2, and highly encouraged to read Descartes' Meditations. Just 1, 2, and 6 if you can't read all of them. All right. Yes, it's on Brightspace. Yep, should already be there. I think I put all of the optional but recommended readings on Brightspace already, so they're all there. Um, and of course, you know how to access the textbook. You can just do that through the library if you've decided not to get your own physical copy, right? You can do it through the library. But that is all for today. Does anyone have any questions before we go? Okay, looks like there aren't any questions. Um, I hope today wasn't too painful. I've taught this course a lot, so I could do this in my sleep, but that you forget when you've spent a lot of time with a subject like this, that it can be maybe a little bit tricky to assimilate some of these new ideas. And so I just want to remind you all, if you're not clear about anything I've said, this goes for those of you who are here now or those of you who are going to watch this later, going to watch the recording. Remember that you can reach out to me if you have a question that you'd like answered and you'd think everyone else would benefit. You can do it on the Discord server, or you can email me. But don't be shy if you do have questions. Otherwise, I hope I've provided a nice little survey following Kim of what we're doing all of this for. And so I will see you on Wednesday, where we will talk about the substance dualism of Rene Descartes. So, bye for now, everyone. See you next time. Yes, thank you all as well. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. See you next time.
Thanks. See you then. Oh, this is just today's top. This is a survey. We've surveyed a lot of stuff we will cover, but we'll get into everything else in much greater depth. And some of the stuff we're going to cover I haven't mentioned today. So this is just a sort of cursory look at philosophy of mind. So, all right. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you Wednesday. Take care.